Hi YouTube, welcome back to Wtf Rc Cars. So continuing with the Ruddog IRIS ONE, moving on to building the axles, and I've just spent the last probably 15 minutes looking for one of these little collars, and when I put it out bag it was stuck in end of one of them and you couldn't see it. So something to bear in mind. And the only other thing I found is one of the tiny little metal pins, and I'll show it you as I'm going through doing video. They've forgot to machine the flat that all the rest have in it, and it is only one, and they all go in the same sort of place on these drive shafts. But I have got an extra one of the tiny little E-clips or C-clips. But they are really small, so when you open bag 5, make sure you tip it out onto like a nice bright surface so you can see them all, and cut the bag open and check all the bottom corners for these tiny little E-clips. But let's bring you in for a close-up look and see how we get on building drive shafts. Right, so where to start? Well, by the looks of it, we've got these tiny little things, and we're going to need to pop a bearing on the top of these. So it looks like the bearing should fit on like that, and then we've got to get one of these tiny little clips, and we've got to try and get that on the top of here. So just try and be so careful that these don't fire off, but basically that's where you need to get them. So we get another of these, and then another tiny little E-clip or C-clip. This is annoying, and they're the coolest drive shafts I've ever seen, but this is really fiddly. So that has got the bearings in place. Next, it's asking us to basically place it on the drive shaft, and it looks like it's telling you to place it on widthways and then put the pin through. So I'm going to put a bit of graphite grease on here just for a little bit of lubrication. And hopefully it'll grab the pin and stop it falling out. So with the drive shaft flat on the widest side going into here, we need to position that, then get the tiny pin, so we've got us pinned through, and the graphite grease should do its job and hold it. Next, we're going to start building this end up. It's telling us to position that way, then that, then as pin. So again, I'm going to put a bit of graphite grease in here. Then we're going to drop the little barrel through. We're going to line this up with the bigger hole to the top. So we've got a liner's pin up to go through the drive shaft with the flat facing upwards. Then we want one of his grub screws with a bit of thread lock, and then we're going to screw straight down onto the flat. Then we've got to screw that in, make sure it's nice and tight, and it's almost looking like a drive shaft. Then if we flip this over, then we're going to need that part. We're going to need a bit more graphite grease. Then you're going to have to get your barrel with the threaded side facing upwards. Graphite grease does help hold all this in position. You're going to want to line that up. Then we're going to take as pin, and you want to get the flat facing outwards. And move it into position. And we're going to need a tiny little grub screw and a little bit of thread lock. And that is one fully assembled drive shaft. Now all we've got to do is try and get the other three together. So we're going to build another exactly same as this one. So I'll get this one assembled. Right, so what you should end up with is two fully functioning drive shafts. And we've got plenty of graphite grease in here. Trust me, graphite grease, when you're putting these fiddly little buggers together, it's definitely a must. And it also looks after the joints in them and everything, so stops any wear. Tends to keep a bit of the crud out as long as you clean them. But two fully built, so I'll get these cleaned up and get the next one set out and see how we build the others. Right, so this is the only anomaly I've got. This one hasn't got a slot cut on it. I'm not sure if that's going to affect anything. But deep breath and here we go again. So these tiny little critters, and we need to get the bearing to sit on. Then one of the tiny little E-clips or C-clips, depends on what you want to call them. And I must admit, of the entire build so far, this is gotta be my least favourite part. Yay, that's one on. These are not nice to work with. Your biggest problem is if they don't go on right, they then fire off. So next thing we're going to need to do is build this part up. So we'll get a bit of graphite grease in it, and as I said, the graphite grease just makes your job so much easier. So we've got to get them that way. And you want to drop your tiny little retaining pin through, and at least the graphite grease, you might get covered in it, but at least it'll hold that little bugger in. Then we want some more grease. See which way round as threads are. Then we get that through. Then if we get that into position, get us pin that's not got any flat machine into it for some reason. So you just need to carefully work the pin in. Then we quickly get some thread lock on here. Now my only concern with that, with not having a flat, is it going to interfere with his drive shaft at all? Because it's definitely going to hit it, because there's no flat in there. But it depends what angle these run at. These are going to be the rears, so maybe we'll get away with that. If not, I shall have to have a word with MB Models and see if they can get me one of these pins with a flat on it, same as what's meant to be in there. And if all goes to plan, that's what you should end up with. 4 nicely built drive shafts. Do seem very smooth to operate, really smooth. Especially these are the design where you have the little pin through middle, so one side does lock into other. But let's crack on. Right, so moving along, we need to get a bearing in the back of this. Let's see how easy they drop in. Don't seem too bad. We need one in the front. Then we're going to drop our drive shaft through these. You should be able to pop the bearings into place fully. So once you've got that through, we're then going to have to put the wheel hex on. You've then got a spacer that goes in. It's not very big, little plastic sort of shim. And just to hold it all together, I'm just going to drop the wheel nut on slightly. So next, it's telling us we need to put this screw through, and I've got a little bit of thread lock on that. So I'm not entirely sure if that's working as like a pinch bolt, but be very careful when you put them together, because they're only threaded on one side, which is why I'm thinking it's designed to work as like a pinch bolt. And on the opposite side one, it goes in front bottom. Then we need to put our steering arm on. And again, I'm going to use a tiny bit of thread lock on these. Doesn't actually tell you in instructions that you put them on the underneath on the next one, but looking further on in the instructions, that certainly looks like it's the way that you put them together. They go opposite on opposite sides, so that's what we should end up with. And you got the screw on the top on that side and the bottom on that side. So let's move on, and I believe it's the rears. So onto the rear hubs. So we need to get his bearings in. Then on this one, we're going to want the little pinch bolt from the top. Then, unlike the fronts, these arms are going on from the bottom. at least that's what it's telling us to. And again, all these screws you're going to want to thread lock, because they're all going into metal and we don't want them coming undone. So we should drop the drive shaft on, then the hex, then again it's asking for the tiny little spacer or shim, whatever it is. Just feels like a little black plastic shim. So that's one built up, and this one kind of opposite way. And again, I'm just going to drop the wheel nut on just to keep hold of it. But basically, that is what you should end up with. So screw on the left hand ones on the top, right hand ones on the bottom, and now we can move on. So you're going to want a bit of thread lock on the top and bottom, and then we're going to want to put that in place, and then you're going to have to carefully line these up, and you want the 2mm spacer to the top. So if we get one side in, we should be able to get us 2mm spacer on the top and this side fastened in. Then if we flip the Aussie over, and I've already put us thread lock on the ball joints. You just need to make sure your drive shafts don't wander off, and there's no spacers on the bottom. So there we have it, as drive shafts all in place. So that does look quite nice, really fluid steering. So let's move on to the rear. So again, we're going to want thread lock on these. We're going to want to get our drive shafts in position. Then we're going to want our spacer on the top, and we should be able to line it up. And we get our drive shafts in again. And we can get a spacer on. Then we're going to need to flip over. And make sure your drive shafts don't go wandering. And that should be his rear arms all in position. So it does show on instructions that all the arms face backwards. So let's see what else we've got. So first thing it's asking us to do is drop the guide shims in place. So we get these placed down in the bottoms of the shock bodies, or damper bodies should I say. And it does tell you to do this before you start filling the shock oil up. So we get all them in. Then it's turn us to build the front shocks with 600 and the rear with 1000 CST. So use these as the front, and I'm not entirely sure how far we need to fill these up. So to start with, I'm just going level with the first ridge, and then it's asking for 1000 in the rear. These do look quite easy to keep the air bubbles out, so not sure what's going to happen once we place the actual dampers inside. Unlike traditional shocks, there's not really anywhere for the air to get caught. So it's asking us to do that and then place the actual dampers in. So let's make sure we get these the right way around. I think, looking at these, so if that's going to be the base of our shock with the two holes sort of up that way, it looks like the damper blade should actually be angled down on that part. So let's carefully place that in and see if we end up with shock oil everywhere. Yeah, it doesn't look too bad. Definitely going to be some cleanup to do. So which one do we have for this one? Then these should go in exactly the same. So I think we're going to have a bit of fluid escape, but at least I know they're going to be full. And it looks like we got the blades the right way, so they tapered down towards the bottom. If we put these on first, and I have put the, so I've put the grease on each one of these O-rings. So you want your shim on and then your O-ring on the outside. Building shocks is always a messy job. So it looks like all his gaskets are fitting on nicely. And as always with shocks, we're going to get in a right old mess. So once they're then put into place, we should then be able to lower on our shock caps. And all those little scrolls are lined up. I was wondering how difficult it were going to be to actually bleed any air out of these, but I think due to the way you fill them, I don't think air trapped in them is going to be an issue. And you're probably better off overfilling them than underfilling them. So next thing we're going to need to do, we've got a whole bunch of screws. So you've got 5 on each. We're going to want to get thread lock on all these. So I'll get a bit of thread lock on them all. And then we're going to want to close them all up. So start with this one first. I'm just going to go around getting these started first off. And don't over tighten these because they're only small threads and small screws, and it'd be very, very easy to sort of strip the threads on these. But so far, other than the normal mess of building shocks, these don't actually seem bad to build. So I'm I'm just going to carefully work my way around. Tightening everything down. So basically that's all we need to do. I'm going to get the screws in the rest of them and then get all this mess cleaned up, and then we'll carry on. So now we've got that cleaned up, it's time to drop these arms on. So we get all these into position, and then you're going to want a little bit of thread lock, and it's turn us to fit the screws from the outside, then just nip them up, and then you have a working damper. So I'll crack on getting the rest of the screws in here, and then see what else we've got to assemble for the suspension. It's starting to look more like a touring car chassis, although it does kind of look like we've got some spaceship parts on it. But let's crack on. Right, so moving on, you need the torsion bar springs and the little plastic caps for the ends, and we need these two little towers for front, the larger one for the rear. You want the 33.1 bars for the rear, 16.7 for front, and it does advise you to use a little bit of grease to get these to hold on. So let's try it. So there is a little cutout for the bar side. So it's basically telling you to fit them like that, and then slide them into these recesses. Not sure how far they're meant to go in. Well, they do pop all the way. So that's one. It certainly doesn't seem too bad getting them to stay on with the grease as it suggests. I'm building these with the numbers facing up, just in case we need to look at the RC at a later date and see which way round they are. So far so good. The little end caps aren't all dropping off everywhere. And they don't seem too bad a fit into the recesses. And must admit, I am enjoying building this suspension. It's nice to build something that's different for once, rather than just your average shocks and springs. I must admit, building RCs, shocks and springs is one of the bits that I don't really look forward to, because it's never really a different experience from one RC to the next. Some might have slightly better made components, but other than that it's pretty much same old same old. But this is very different. Right, so that is the springs assembled. Now we just have the tiny little shock, so I'll get the rest of the components ready for that part and then see how we go. So first off, we've got the lovely little clips. Let's see how we get on with these. These are slightly bigger than the ones that was on the drive shafts, but we haven't got any spares of these, so if this goes firing off, we're kind of stuck. So I need to be pretty careful getting these on. So far so good. There doesn't seem to be any direction for the damper. So not as bad as doing the actual drive shafts. Now this part I have put some grease on it, and then it says to try and get this down inside it using a wrench or a hex wrench, but I'm going to try and get it started by hand. And then it says that we've got to try and stuff it inside there, but I've got it greased up, so it should make it a bit easier, hopefully. It's definitely worth getting plenty of grease on it, but it does eventually sit in there. So then you need to be really careful. I tend to try and screw these on through the threads because it's so easy to cut these little bearing, little O-rings, and then you do feel it when it goes through. So then it's telling us we need the slightly bigger O-ring on the outside. Guess this is going to be a shock seal, so we'll get that down. So I think now I'm going to fill the shock body. It has got a tiny bleed hole in the bottom, so what we should be able to do is screw that on and just cover the bleed hole. And then for this one, it's telling us we need 300 CST. So as we screw this together, you start seeing the oil come out the bottom. So I'm going to sort of slide it halfway in and then tighten this up, and that should lock it off. I think that's the idea. So we just need to get this cleaned up. So we now have the shock to finish assembling. So we're going to need the spring. And then we've got the collar. So it says the stock setting is 3mm. Not entirely sure how easy this is going to be to screw together, because that's a pretty small thread to get started. But it looks like there is enough to at least compress the spring down and get hold of it with the shock pliers. So if I wind this all the way up, can I see the end at threads? Yeah, because I don't want to keep screwing away at that and strip the threads off. So looks like that's as little damper assembled at least. So let's move on. Right, so carrying on, Looks like, much like the D2 Evo with the odd little machining issues, looks like Ruddog or Iris has also got a few quality control issues. One of these little ball joints is about half the length of the others for some reason. Looks like it will work, but just little attention to detail on stuff like that. End of the day, it is a premium price kit, and it would be nice if it was made correctly, or the parts were at least machined correctly. But we've got thread lock on each one of these, so we need to get these screwed in. And this is where I'm going to use the one that's really short. Shouldn't be too much stress on it, and it does look like it's got enough threads to at least be usable, but it's nowhere near the end of that, and the rest of them are. So carrying on. Right, so where it looks like we need to position this, it's probably going to be easier to drop one of these on first, then get the second one on, and these need to go underneath the actual sway bar and come out at the front of the RC. So if we get that into position, then we should be able to slide one of the damper setups on. And then we've got two more screws. And you want a bit of thread lock on all these. Then we should be able to get the other side in, so again under the sway bar, and then we can get this screwed in. So basically got to try and line that up with these little plastic bits, and then get that to sit down to where we need it. Then we should be able to get the final two screws back in. I'm not really sure what one at Neighbours is trying to do to his car, but he's got bonnet open, and the it keeps going off constantly. Which, although it's annoying for my video, it's got to be even more annoying when you've got your head stuck under the bonnet and your root won't stop going off. Right, so once we've got them in place, should now be able to flip it back over. And then I think we got them in wrong place, so I need to switch the ball joints around. Right, that's better. Luckily they're really easy to get driver into, so then we just need to pop this shock on. So we've got nice free movement, and then that's got a shock between it, and I suppose once we get links on we'll have some suspension. But let's move on, see what else we've got. Right, so I think the first thing that I'm going to do is get that into position. So if we do that and that, And we should be able to get the torsion bar springs fastened in. And now I know it's quite easy to get to ball joints, I think I'm going to put them on last. So that's one on. I need to switch sides on these. And then we've got to try and slide these over the little plastic inserts. They're easier to put into position than what I thought they'd be. Then we can go for the opposite side. Right, that should have our rear dampers in place now. Then all that's left to do is get these in position. It looks like they go on the outermost holes. So that is our rear springs and dampers, and the front springs and dampers all in position. So let's see what else we've got. Right, so we're using an Wtf Rc servo, don't forget to centre it. So we're also using the Iris servo arm, but don't use the screw it tells you to. Use the screw that comes with your servo, because it tells you to use a 3x6 and it barely comes through their own actual servo arm by about 2mm. You're just going to destroy your servo on, or the output of your servo. So first thing we're going to need to do is get the servo mounted itself. And you're going to want thread lock on all these. So I'm just going to start by just nipping down these a little bit. And we're using 3 of the 3x6 button head screws for this. So what I would do is get it on a nice flat surface before you tighten these up, so at least you know the servo's going to sit flush with the bottom of this, so you don't want the servo sticking out further than the bottom, because I'm sure it'd cause interference when we try and fasten it into the RC. So once we've got that on, we're then going to need a little bearing. We're going to sit that on. We're going to put another bearing in the top. Then you can fasten these down with another of these little button screws. Yeah, that looks like it fastens down nice. Then we're going to need the 1.5mm driver again, because you've got tiny little pinch screw that goes through here, and again I've thread locked all these. That feels really nice. Then we're going to have to position the slider. So it looks like 2 down from the top is a stock position, or the 3rd should I say, looking at it. Get a screw in place for that, and then you've got the little bar, we've got it lined up with the 3rd one down. Then we're going to need a ball joint in. Then we're going to have to assemble servo horn. So I think the only thing we can do with this is set it central, and then you've at least got movement either way. It is a nice design having a adjustable servo arm. Really do like that. So we've got the servo arm with the adjustments on. You can slide it up and down. So it does feel like it sits on there rather nice. Then we've got the servo screw that came with the servo itself. And then we've got a nice little pinch bolt on the side of this. So we can do that up as well. So there we have the servo assembly. So let's see what we've got next. Right, so moving on, we're going to need 5 of the shorter turnbuckles made up, and these have no ball joints, and these are all 16mm. Then you're going to need 2 making up with the ball joints both on the same side, and they need to be 26mm. And then you need 2 making up, and these are going to have ball joint 1 on either side, and these are 26.5. So we'll get these all put together and crack on. So first thing it's asking for us to do is put one of the links from 6.1 onto a steering. So we've now got that in place. Let's see what else we're going to have to do. So first we're going to need to put this in place and line it up over the top of the belt, and then the 2 holes we're going to want a couple of tapered head screws in there, and they're going to want thread lock on them. So this should line up as servo. If you just snug these down one at a time, it should sort of self-center for you because they are countersunk. That's got a servo mechanism in place. Does look a bit bling. Then it's asking us to fit the front arms. So these are from the 9.1 step. So see if we can get them into place. There's not a lot of room to get any force on there, but you can do it. So that's one in place. Yeah, they're not too bad. So we now have front suspension. Then the 2 arms that we made up, they're going to need screwing in, and it looks like we're going from underneath with these. So we're going to need a 6mm screw, button head with a bit of copper with a bit of thread lock on it. Then if we move the servo arm over, should be able to line up the next screw, which is going to be an 8mm screw, button head again. Not the easiest things to tighten up these, because you've got a ball joint on the other side that just spins. So again, little 6mm screw in the outside. And we should be able to move the steering over. Get the final one on. So we now have steering, And we've got suspension. So it actually looks and feels quite nice. So, moving on, let's see what else it's got in store for us. Right, so moving on, we've got the links to put on the rear. So it's going to be easy to flip this one over. And then we're going to want little 6mm screws in from the bottom. Then same again on the opposite side. So they just come towards the centre. It's not telling us to fasten them down on anything as yet. So then we've got to try and get these on. So these might be a bit fiddly. They're not too bad. So we now have front and rear suspension. So let's see what else it's got in store for us. Right, so moving on, we've got the body mount system to sort out. So I'm just going to need some tapered head screws. I think these are the 8mm ones. That's one. So that's got the 2 shock mounts. Then we're going to be able to pass this through the bumper. So then this should line up. And we can get 2 more screws in. So that looks like it's got our front bumper assembled. So should now be able to do the back one. So now we've got the back carbon piece. Then it's asking for us to use these little 6mm things again, and again they look too short, but let's just double check. Yep, they are the 6mm ones, but these do look a bit on short side. You've got all that depth and literally they just few mil into them. I'm not sure if this is intentional, so they'll rip out rather than break the carbon, possibly, but they barely into these body post mounts. I think these could have done with being 8 or 12mm instead. But we shall see. End of the day, they're only holding a body on, so it's not like they've got a lot of weight on them or stress. They do feel quite solidly on there. So let's see what else we've got. Alright, we're now moving on to mounting the front bumper. Looks like it fits nicely in between the shocks. So if we spin this over and its turners, we need a little 6mm and then 2 8mm, and it's almost looking like an RC now. So I'll get them tightened down and see what else we got. Right, so looks like we're going to need a bit of thread lock on these 4 screws for the rear, and I'm thinking by the look of this design you get one rear end and you're pretty much going to be buying this part again, because this is literally just balancing on end of there. So hopefully you race with some decent drivers and they don't rear end you constantly. Then we've got to swing our suspension arms under, or tie bars, and we're just going to pop one screw in each of them. Alright, so that's got us front and rear body posts on. So let's see what else we've got. Right, so from what I can tell, you put the tiny little plastic inserts into these. Then we've got a little grub screw that you can screw down onto them. And it looks like that's intended to let you sort of shrink the battery size down. Yeah, that's got it. So we've got two of these. So you're going to have one up front, one up back. Let's get another tiny little grub screw in. So I believe the idea of that is so you can poke these out and just shrink the battery size down a bit. But we have these that are going to go on, and it looks like we've got these little shims for underneath, and we got two screws. So if we get one screw and then we got a couple of little shims, so try and get them in place. Then we're going to have that, and then it looks like it intends us to screw that down onto the top of it. So let's see if I can get that started, then get the other screw in through all the shims and everything. So it seems like that's what it's intending us to do. Let's see if I can get the same on the other side. So looks like that's how it intends it to go in, but I'm not sure. So the little stops, you can adjust them to accommodate whatever battery, but you can't really get your hand down to adjust them. So pretty much once they poked back in, they poked back in. You can't get to that. It's pretty difficult. The only one you're going to be able to adjust really is the front one. So I think if you build it the way it's intended, then these are going to be your way of holding your battery down, but you've got very little in the way of movement to hold battery in. And let's have a look. If you screwed them down, you would only have so you're only looking about a 21mm battery. I'm sure we can work something out for it. Overall, quite happy with it. Feels really nice. Feels really solid now it's built. And suspension feels quite nice. But this video's been long enough. Still got the radio gear and everything, motor to put in, speed controller, but it's been long enough, this one. So let's wrap it up. Right, so this is where the manual leaves us. So there's no suggestion on where to put the ESC or receiver, or any instruction on how you mount the fan that you can buy for this. The battery posts, I'm not a huge fan of this design. I think I'd rather have a Velcro strap over it. But the actual build itself, quite interesting to build. The wheels and tyres fit absolutely fine. The instructions that tell you to use the 1/2 mil shim on the back here, it does leave the rear wheels sort of canted right in. I've definitely put them up to a 2 mil shim. I think it's 1 mil shims actually that it tells you to use. I've put both the 1 mil shims together on the backs and used the spare 2 mil shim to bring the wheels out a little bit. There was quite a lot of towing on the back with the standard link lengths. Steering doesn't look too bad. Bit of a weird design on the steering. There's no sort of end stops as such, so you can get oversteer quite easy on it. But I think once you set your end points, you're only going to be wanting to sort of turn to about that. You're not going to want to go much further. So it's definitely all on your servo for the end point adjustment and the end stops. Adjustment of these shims is a little annoying because you've got to back these out to relieve the tension on the ball cups, but then if you want to swap these spacers out, you can't actually get any kind of driver into them, so you've got to remove those 2 screws to lift these up to actually get them out. Kind of looking at the design, I think this would have been better with a turnbuckle style, so you could just dial it in on front and rear. And you could, because you've got flats on these, you could actually remove the little anodized washer and the shim, and you could just use a spanner to turn them. So it may be better off leaving them off, setting your vehicle up, and then once you know your actual gaps, then re-shimming it that way. Overall, quality seems really nice. We don't seem to be getting any leaks from the shocks, so don't really seem to be a concern with that. Does look like it's really nicely spaced out. Looks like there's plenty of room. If you try really large packs like this, you can actually fit them in. And all I've done is, if I drop one of these out, so all I've done on this is put a little 2 mil anodized spacer and then a nut on the bottom, so I can sort of still tighten these down, but it does give it a little bit more support. But it does hold the battery in really well. I don't have any concerns even with large heavier batteries like this. And once you've got it set up, you can just spin one that way and then get your pack in and out. So that's not too bad. I probably will look for some way of putting straps around it. If they'd got a slot cut in either one of these, you could just feed a strap through, which would hold it quite well. But not really concerned about that. You could also put some of the 3M lock tape down and sort of lock the battery in place anyway, and then these clips are just there for a little bit of added support. Does overall build though, does feel really nice. The instructions are a little bit lacking, as in it doesn't tell you why we're leaving these screws out, so it's either for setup or not really sure. They don't really do anything. Even if you screwed them up way in, they won't do anything. Not sure if they could do anything for the end stops. Looking at it, possibly on this in the centre, they could have built end stops into that. Would have been quite nice. The actual steering geometry looks right. There is a bit of a weirdness with it where if you turn that way, there's no stop on this side, so it would let it oversteer. But obviously the arm that holds the servo, if you turn this way, that limits it. So just another bit stuck up on the other side, would have given you some end stops just in case you take quite a bad hit. It's not going to try and shove your wheel around and break your servo. Depending on your ride height as well, these arms, so if you have increased ride height, these arms will hit the little towers for the front torsion bar springs. Other things the instructions didn't mention, so there's no mention of this bottom tensioner. So there is 2 bearings left once we've finished the kit, and I've gone through the online instructions that are available as well. So there is a wider bearing that's left, which goes here, and I'll put you some pictures up so you can see what I mean. This bearing on the top, it does advise you to use a button head, but it works far better with a countersunk screw. If you put the button head in and tighten the screw down even slightly, it locks the bearing up. Likewise, if you were to use a button head on either one of these, it would lock your bearing up because the button head sort of crushes the bearing. And I've had to put a few spacers behind just to allow the bearing to be free. And it's clear that these are the way you tension the belt, front and rear belt, but there's no mention of it whatsoever in the instructions. So overall, really nice build. The instructions definitely need work, and I think for me I'd prefer these to have been turnbuckles and not just fixed. There's also no way to sort of move your hubs, so you can't change the angle of your hubs easily anyway, from what I can see. You could adjust the length of these sort of off center. That would move your hub, but it's also going to move it in the other direction at the same time. But that is a possibility. On a touring car, don't really think you're going to want to move them anyway. But the rest of the adjustability is quite nice. These are quite easy to get to, although having to use the bespoke little tool does mean you've got no option of sort of winding them all the way out. You have to undo them bit by bit, or take these 4 screws out and then you can undo them. But overall, quite a nice build. There's pretty much zero play in anything. That's one thing that is really, really impressive. There's just no slack in anything at all. The steering, everything feels extremely tight. Fluid in movement, but extremely tight tolerances, which is impressive. And I do love the way they've gone with the torsion bar springs and the laid down dampers. Just lets the centre of gravity on this car will be extremely low, which for a touring car is brilliant. And if you've seen any of my other videos, the Tamiya TT02, I was getting grip roll in that. I've had to work out how to drop the car. The droop screws, fantastic addition to it, makes it really easy to dial in your ride height. The suspension feels incredibly smooth. But yeah, we've still got the electronics to fit. As I say, the instructions give no direction on that at all. I tend to think if you're buying this sort of level of RC, you shouldn't really need to be told how to put your motor and your speed control and your receiver in, and it's going to be very down to personal preference where you want the weight distribution, and dependent on what battery size you're using and the weight of your battery, where you want to place stuff. So I kind of get it. The screws on these were really short. Other than that, the actual aluminium parts, shocks, everything, chassis, carbon parts, no issues with. The only slight issue I've had is with, seems to be a bit of a quality control issue. So one of the little ball ends, the sort of threads were about half of what they should have been. I think that were on the rear suspension somewhere. And one of the drive pins, they'd forgot to machine the flat in it. Luckily I managed to use that on one of the rear drive shafts. Doesn't seem to have made an issue to it. There's no binding up under full travel on suspension or anything. But hopefully you find this video useful or entertaining. Bit of an insight if you're thinking of buying one of these. There's nothing that stopped me building the car that was wrong with the kit. There were them two little machining issues, and also the instructions make no mention whatsoever to this pulley and that one. Bit of a strange one. Not sure if it's a bit of an afterthought, but it does look like the entire kit was designed for it. So the pictures on the IRIS ONE Ruddog website do show them bearings in place, and they do come in kit, but no mention whatsoever of fitting them in instructions, unless I've seriously missed something. But thanks again for watching Wtf Rc Cars. If you like this kind of content, don't forget to like and subscribe, share to friends and family, and hit that notification bell, and hopefully you'll be back to see what we do finishing this body shell wise motor in ESC. Catch you guys again in the next one.